blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
John Carpenter's iconic 1978 horror slasher Halloween is a stone-cold classic and a high watermark for the genre as a whole, standing the test of time for over 4 decades and counting. In fact, its popularity and influence has endured for so long that a new sequel, Halloween Kills, is coming out later this year, which is now the canonically 3rd film in the franchise. But how can that be? Even a cursory Google search will show that there were 7 Halloween sequels prior to Halloween Kills, and 9 if you count Rob Zombie's 2007 remake and its sequel. So what gives? Well, here's the rub. The thing is, the Halloween series might have one of the most convoluted continuities out of any horror franchise. And this is a genre that includes Friday the 13th in it, which began as a story about a murderous mother to being about said mother's hulking zombie son wearing a hockey mask, then being about a worm that possesses people for some reason. So with this video series, we're going to explore the various timelines of the Halloween franchise, what led to those films, why the changes were made, and what it meant for the series as a whole. Now let's begin with the first timeline, which contains the aforementioned film as well as its sequel Halloween 2, and finally the first deviance in the timeline, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Now, there are many things that make Halloween the classic that it is. First off, there's the lean, mean direction of John Carpenter, who is great at staging suspense and tension, such as the brutal closet attack scene, with efficiency and clarity utilizing shadows and darkness to create some truly frightening and memorable moments, with Myers dressed as a sheet ghost attacking being a highlight. Some great unique camera work. The opening POV shot of child Michael Myers' first kill is both a haunting and harrowing sequence, while also being very technically impressive as well. And composing the iconic synth score that elevated the horror and was a catchy earworm to boot. Not only that, but the story, also written by Carpenter, who he co-wrote with then-girlfriend Debra Hill, was great as well, elevating it from simply an exploitation film to something more horrifying and elemental. While not extremely complicated plot-wise, it nonetheless economically gets out all of its backstory, and like his direction, becomes lean and mean, as the emotionless Michael Myers, called simply The Shape in screenplay, chases down teenagers with a creepy and horrifying blank stare, an emotionless and unreasonable personification of evil that sticks with you, which was based on a visit to a psychiatric institution Carpenter once took, where he said he had witnessed an adolescent boy who possessed a blank, schizophrenic stare that gave him nightmares. As for the film itself, it is about Michael Myers, aka The Shape, stalking virginal teenager played by the then unknown actress Jamie Lee Curtis, and killing off her friends and a dog one by one during his bloody pursuit. Not only that, but Myers himself is being chased down as well, however by his former psychiatrist Dr. Sam Loomis, played by veteran actor Donald Pleasance. The film's success, making $70 million, or $300 million accounting for inflation, at the box office, was made all the more impressive when considering the film was extremely low budget, costing only $300,000, or $1.2 million in total, making it one of the most successful independent movies, even to this day. Not only that, but the aforementioned low budget led to a lot of creativity behind the scenes, including the infamous story of buying a $1 Captain Kirk mask and painting it white to create the iconic Michael Myers or The Shape look that has more or less stayed the same over the years. The low budget also limited Carpenter's casting choices, as he originally envisioned the heroic Dr. Loomis, named after the character of Sam Loomis, the boyfriend of Marion Crane from Hitchcock's classic Psycho, being played by old-school horror luminaries such as Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, who both turned it down due to the low salary. Lee later stated after seeing the film that it was the greatest regret of his life. Donald Pleasance, meanwhile, only joined onto the project because, in his own words, and I quote, "I don't know why I'm in this movie and I don't know who my character is. The only reason I'm doing this movie is because I have alimony to pay, and my daughter in England's in a rock and roll group, and she said the music that you did for Assault on Precinct 13 is cool." The casting of then unknown Jamie Lee Curtis was of course fortuitous, as she's the daughter of famous old school starlet Janet Leigh, who played Marion Crane in the previously mentioned Psycho, and who was notoriously killed on screen by Norman Bates in that iconic shower scene. However, that wasn't Carpenter's first choice for the role of Laurie, as he sought after Anne Lockhart, the daughter of June Lockhart from Lassie, for the role, who couldn't take it for scheduling reasons. Who knows how that version would have turned out, but it's hard to imagine she would have been better than Curtis in the iconic role. Now, while John Carpenter's first Halloween film is often credited as the original proto-slasher, that isn't quite accurate. True, the film did indeed usher in the golden age of slasher for the entirety of the 1980s and into the 90s, paving the way for such indelible horror franchises as the previously mentioned Friday the 13th films, the Nightmare on Elm Street films, and even the Scream franchise. It also had many historical influences that preceded it. These included Alfred Hitchcock's often mentioned 1960 horror classic Psycho, which pushed the boundaries of violence and explicitness in mainstream films at the time, despite being very tame by today's standards, as well as the Italian giallo films during the same decade, including The Girl Who Knew Too Much and Blood and Black Lace. These, alongside the rise of splatter flicks like Blood Feast and the grindhouse exploitation films such as Tobe Hooper's 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Bob Clark's, of A Christmas Story and Baby Genius fame's Black Christmas, helped create the ideal circumstances for Halloween's impending arrival in terms of audiences' expectations for films to be more explicit and edgy in terms of their horror films. So while Halloween isn't actually the first slasher produced, as it's sometimes been claimed, it definitely, nonetheless, still perfected the formula and thus remains standing as a hallmark film in the genre. Of course, with the first film's success came the call from money-hungry producers for a rushed sequel. Carpenter, however, was reluctant to make one as he felt the story had already been told in the first film and there wasn't much more to tell. So in his own words, he had said, "I had made that film once and I really didn't want to do it again." However, Carpenter was convinced back to the series by the paycheck and appointed first-time director Rick Rosenthal, who had previously worked on television and got the job based on a short of his, to direct the sequel, while he and Debra Hill continued with the writing duties, which apparently wasn't a fun experience, with Carpenter reminiscing that, and I quote, "I mainly dealt with a lot of beer, sitting in front of a typewriter saying, 'What the fuck am I doing? I don't know.'" Furthermore, Halloween 2 was also definitively meant to be the end of the Laura Strode Michael Myers, with Carpenter even stating at one point in an interview, "The shape is dead, Pleasant's character is dead too, unfortunately." And after seeing the film, Carpenter was ultimately displeased with it and in fact had directed many scenes to add more gore to the film, much to the dismay of Rosenthal. He even regretted the retcon that Laura Strode was actually Mike Myers' sister, later calling it silly and foolish. Unfortunately, Halloween was still too much of a success to leave well enough alone, with 1981's Halloween 2 making more money than the other slasher sequel that year, Friday the 13th Part 2, so another sequel was quickly commissioned. However, Carpenter only agreed to participate in the new project if it was not a direct sequel to Halloween 2 and Michael Myers was no longer the focus. Furthermore, he demanded that the Halloween franchise be turned into an anthology series of films, with each new entry focusing on a different horror story connected solely by taking place around the holiday. In fact, Tommy Lee Wallace, who had served as art director and production designer on the original Halloween film and previously declined to direct Halloween 2, eventually signed on to direct 1982's Halloween 3 Season of the Witch and agreed with Carpenter on the new direction, stating, and I quote, "It is our intention to create an anthology out of the series, sort of along the lines of Night Gallery or The Twilight Zone, only on a much larger scale, of course." There were, of course, many ideas pitched for the third film, but the story they landed on ended up being about an evil toy maker who is trying to use custom Halloween masks with microchips made from pieces of Stonehenge to manipulate and kill children using a mixture of ancient rituals, technology, and witchcraft to do so. The great Tom Atkins starred as the grumpy, chain-smoking Dr. Daniel Chalice, who loves a good drink as well. Halloween 3 also boasts one of the most unique kills in the franchise at the hands of one of the Silver Shamrock masks. Now, while definitely a far cry from its slasher roots, it's actually not too far off from the aforementioned anthology structure of things like The Twilight Zone, which would jump through different genres ranging from psychological horror to sci-fi to supernatural thrillers, etc. Unfortunately, Halloween 3 paid for this deviance by being lambasted by critics, bombing at the box office, and confusing fans. It should be noted that its reputation has improved over the years, with many fans coming around to its unique story. Scream Factory even gave it an excellent Steelbook Blu-ray, and even Darcy the Mail Girl has been a big proponent for trying to get it on the last drive-in with Joe Bob Briggs. And no matter where you stand on the film, we can all agree that Atkins and his glorious mustache are always a welcomed addition. This is the only film, so far I suppose, to exist in this timeline with none of its events referenced in any of the other later sequels. In fact, the fourth Halloween film, appropriately subtitled The Return of Michael Myers, acts as a sequel directly to Halloween 2, making Part 4 technically still part of the original timeline. Halloween 3's utter failure, despite a recent critical reprisal, is the reason why the Halloween series went back to the old Michael Myers well with 1988's previously mentioned Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, with a disappointed John Carpenter finally washing his hands of the series until very recently and signing away the rights to the movies. So, what do you guys think? Would you have preferred that Loomis and Myers killed each other at the end of 2 and that the Halloween franchise continued as a horror anthology series instead? If not, what version of the franchise do you prefer most? Either way, sound off in the comments below.
How sweet, fresh meat.
With this video, we're continuing our journey through the various timelines in the Halloween franchise, and now we've reached the point where Halloween movies started flat out ignoring previous entries. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, had been set in a different universe than the first two Halloween movies, but it did still acknowledge their existence, as John Carpenter's Halloween was shown on a TV in that film. But Halloween 4 takes us back to the story that Halloween and Halloween 2 had started, the story of masked slasher Michael Myers. To do so, the film had to just forget Halloween 3 ever happened, and while it would be controversial when future sequels decided to ignore previous movies, most fans didn't mind that Halloween 3 had been set aside. They were just happy to be seeing the return of Michael Myers. The fact that Halloween 3's attempt to turn this into an anthology series was a failed experiment was something that everyone quickly accepted. Halloween creators John Carpenter and Debra Hill were still involved when executive producer Mustafa Akkad laid down the law and said Michael Myers would be coming back for Halloween 4. Carpenter and Hill were even responsible for hiring Part 4's first screenwriter, Dennis Etchison, who had written the novelizations of Halloweens 2 and 3 under a pseudonym. The plan was to have Etchison write the script and Joe Dante direct the film, but Etchison took a supernatural approach to bringing Michael Myers back to Haddonfield, Illinois, and that wasn't what Akkad was looking for. When he rejected the Etchison script, Carpenter and Hill sold their stake in the franchise to him and walked away. The Halloween 4 we did get came from the creative team of director Dwight H. Little and writer Alan B. McElroy. And after an atmospheric title sequence that perfectly captures the look and feel of a Midwestern Halloween, we find out how they overcame the challenge of bringing Michael Myers back without Jamie Lee Curtis. While Myers seemed to be choosing victims at random in the first Halloween, Halloween 2 had established that he was specifically pursuing Curtis's babysitter character, Laurie Strode, because she was his sister. He had killed his older sister on Halloween night when he was just 6 years old, and after a 15-year stay in a mental institution, he had escaped to kill his younger sister on Halloween. If you don't have Curtis as Laurie, what is his motivation? Of course, you go to the next generation in the bloodline. Comatose since Dr. Loomis set him on fire at the end of Halloween 2, Myers regains consciousness after 10 years when he hears that he has a niece. That niece is 7-year-old Jamie Lloyd, played by Danielle Harris. As of Halloween 1988, 11 months have passed since her parents died in a car accident, and Jamie is now in the care of the Carruthers family, the most prominent member of her adoptive family being the teenage Rachel Carruthers, played by Ellie Cornell. Rachel has a date set up on Halloween, but when her parents have an important event to attend, their usual babysitter has broken an ankle. Rachel gets stuck watching Jamie and taking her trick-or-treating, not realizing that Jamie has a homicidal uncle who is stalking the streets of their hometown of Haddonfield looking for the little girl and knocking off anyone who gets in his way. Luckily for Jamie and Rachel, Donald Pleasance is also back as Dr. Loomis, even though he was caught in the explosion with Michael Myers at the end of Halloween 2. Myers ended up in a coma, but Loomis was somehow virtually unscathed. He only sports a bit of scarring on his face, and on a hand he keeps covered with a glove. Just like in the first two movies, Loomis is on the trail of his former patient, out to stop his reign of terror. For filmmakers stuck with the Michael Myers is out to kill his relatives concept introduced in Halloween 2, and also stuck with having to bring back the villain without the heroine, Little and McElroy did an awesome job of continuing the Myers story. With Halloween 4, they delivered a film that ranks highly among the best slashers of the 1980s. When he was hired to write the script, McElroy only had 11 days to knock it out because the Writers Guild was about to go on strike. He did it, and you can see in the finished film that he was aided by the fact that he stuck very closely to the structure of the first movie. There are times when Halloween 4 is a direct copy of the first Halloween. It's just bigger, flashier, and bloodier. Michael Myers escaped from the mental institution without killing anyone in the first movie. But when he escapes from custody in part 4, he massacres an ambulance full of people and leaves a bloody mess. He killed a mechanic to steal his overalls off-screen the first time. He kills a mechanic on-screen here, and Loomis just doesn't find evidence that Myers did this like he did in 78. He finds the body, sees Myers, and there's gunfire and explosions. And in the end, Myers doesn't just get 6 shots by one person, he gets pumped full of lead by a bunch of police officers and knocked into a mine shaft. Halloween 4 ends with a moment that echoes the beginning of the first Halloween. Myers killed his older sister while wearing a clown costume, and the implication is that evil is hereditary when Jamie Lloyd, wearing a clown costume, picks up a pair of scissors and starts slashing away at her adoptive mother. This everything old is new again approach worked out very well. Halloween 4 was a hit, and fans were very happy to see Michael Myers rampaging across the screen once again. Jamie Lee Curtis may have been missed, but viewers were quite impressed by child actress Danielle Harris. Her performance as Jamie Lloyd endeared her to a lot of horror fans, and she remains a prolific genre icon to this day. The return of Michael Myers was a triumphant one, and Akkad wanted to strike while the iron was hot. Halloween 5 reached theaters the very next year, and things didn't go so smoothly with that one, mainly because the filmmakers made the mistake of overthinking and overcomplicating a very simple concept. Michael Myers is a masked maniac who kills people on Halloween. That's as complicated as Halloween ever needed to be. The Laurie Strode as his sister edition was unnecessary, and the unnecessary additions go much further in both the 5th and 6th films. Halloween 5 begins by showing us how exactly Michael Myers escaped from the ending of the previous film. He's swept down a river and ends up at the home of someone who takes care of him as he lies dormant for the next year. This would have made some sense if the film had stuck with the original intention of director Dominique Othon-Girard and his co-writers, which was to have the caretaker be an occultist called Dr. Death. This guy would have been a Mike Myers fan, responsible for drawing a symbol on the killer's wrist that represents eternal life. Of course, someone called Dr. Death would keep Myers in their house for a year, but after the scenes with Dr. Death were filmed, the decision was made to replace him in reshoots. The finished film, Myers is taken in by an old hermit, and it's not clear why this guy lets him sleep in his shack for a year. We still see the symbol on Myers' wrist, but since we didn't see Dr. Death or the hermit put it there, we have to assume that this was something that was always on his wrist, we just never saw it. Why the hell does Michael Myers have a symbol tattooed on his wrist? This whole symbol thing gets even stranger when a man in black catches a bus into Haddonfield and we see this mysterious person also has the symbol tattooed on their wrist. Who is the man in black? And what is the symbol supposed to mean now? The fact is, no one involved with Halloween 5 had any idea. The filmmakers just randomly decided to throw the man in black into the mix and have him lurking around in a handful of scenes throughout the movie. The only possible explanation that was considered during the filming was the man in black might be Michael Myers' twin brother we had never heard about before. That's why both characters are played by the same person, stuntman Don Shanks. When Myers wakes up just in time for Halloween 1989, we find that Jamie has become more like her uncle in that she no longer speaks. She's a patient at a children's clinic and is said to be 9 years old in this one, so somehow aged 2 years in just 1 year. She also has developed a psychic connection to her uncle, so sometimes she is able to see through Michael Myers' eyes as he stalks and kills people around her. Among his victims is Rachel, and killing her off was a very unpopular move. Fans who came to care about her in Halloween 4 were not happy to see her make an early exit from Halloween 5, especially since she's replaced by one of the most disliked characters in the entire franchise, the very wacky Tina, played by Wendy Kaplan. This sequel is bogged down by bad writing and poor decisions, but it does have some classic scenes of slashing and suspense, including a chase scene involving a Camaro and an incredible climactic sequence that takes place inside the crumbling old Myers house. That location was another questionable choice since the house looks nothing like the one we saw in the first two movies, but what happens inside the place is great. Then, everything falls apart with a cliffhanger ending where the man in black walks into the Haddonfield Police Department with a machine gun, rescues Myers from a jail cell. Nobody knew why that happened, and they left that up to the makers of Halloween 6 to figure out. Part 6 wouldn't come along until 6 years after the release of 5, so the mystery of the man in black was on the minds of Halloween fans for quite a long time. The mystery was solved in the film where Michael Myers' saga went completely off the rails. Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers, directed by Joe Chappelle. By the time you're done watching it, you might wish it had been directed by Dave Chappelle. Although scripts involving virtual reality and Myers being dragged to hell by demons just like Jason Voorhees was in Jason Goes to Hell were rightfully rejected, the Halloween 6 we got still went in a direction these movies should never have. It explains Myers' evil by saying he's the latest in a long line of people that have been afflicted by the curse of Thorn, which compels the cursed person to kill their family. And this urge to kill is especially strong when the constellation of stars in the form of the Druid Thorn rune appears in the sky. That symbol on Myers' wrist, that's the Thorn rune, which is why he's now surrounded by a druid cult that has kept him safe for the 6 years since the events of Part 5. This cult idea didn't come out of nowhere. Screenwriter Daniel Farrens was drawing inspiration from the novelization of the first film, which dug into the druid roots of the Halloween holiday, as well as from the scene in Halloween 2 when Loomis discovers that Myers has written the word Samhain on a wall at a crime scene, something which always felt out of character for Myers and was another sure sign that John Carpenter was feeling desperate when trying to give Part 2 some kind of story. The leader of the cult is the Man in Black, who is revealed to be Dr. Wynn, a character we previously saw in the first Halloween and is now played by Mitchell Ryan. Why exactly Wynn came to Haddonfield in the previous movie is never explained, nor do we find out why a doctor who leads a cult had to resort to catching a bus to get there. What we do discover is that both Myers and Jamie Lloyd, now a teenager played by J.C. Brandy because the Dimension films didn't want to bring Danielle Harris back, have been in the custody of the cult ever since the ending of Part 5. And somewhere along the line, Jamie got pregnant because the curse of Michael Myers begins with her giving birth to a boy who will be named Steven. Which brings us to the fact that there are two very different cuts of the Curse of Michael Myers out there. There's the theatrical cut, which has a flashy editing and plays down the cult aspect as we get near the end, and there's the so-called producer's cut, which goes all in on the cult idea. There's no indication of who fathered Jamie's baby in the theatrical version of the movie, while the producer's cut implies that Myers impregnated his niece during some kind of cult ritual. It seems the cult needs to sacrifice this baby so the curse of Thorn will be passed on to someone else, and it looks like the next candidate is a young Haddonfield kid named Danny, the grandson of Laurie Strode's adoptive father's brother. This is really starting to sound like a soap opera, right? Danny, his mom, his uncle, his grandparents now live in the old Myers' house, which looks more like it did in the first two movies than it did in Part 5. Living across the street is a grown-up Tommy Doyle, the kid Laurie was babysitting in the first movie. Now he's played by future Ant-Man Paul Rudd, and he has figured all of this Thorn stuff out. He also ends up taking care of baby Steven and trying to keep him safe from Myers after Jamie Lloyd gets killed. Tommy is aided in this endeavor by Danny's mom Kara, played by Marion Hagen, and by good old Dr. Loomis, who is shocked to find out his old buddy Wynn was the Man in Black. After Myers stalks through the streets of Haddonfield on yet another Halloween night, really putting a damper on the movement to bring Halloween celebrations back to the town after they've been banned for years, the climax of the film takes place at Smith's Grove Sanitarium, the same place Myers escaped from the start of the first movie. The ending is where the theatrical cut and the producer's cut really go off in different directions. Committed to the cult idea, the producer's cut has Myers immobilized with a magic trick that Tommy pulls off with a circle of stones. It's the power of the runes. Then, Wynn and Myers swap clothes while Loomis receives the Thorn curse and has to become the leader of the new cult. Yeah, they actually filmed that stuff. They thought it was a good idea at the time. The theatrical cut, on the other hand, ditches the cult nonsense, has Myers massacre a bunch of the cult members, then adds its own brand of nonsense with mention of genetic engineering and shots of fetuses in aquariums. How did the Halloween franchise get here? And when Tommy gives Myers a beatdown with a lead pipe, why is there green liquid leaking out of his mask? These are the questions that will never be answered because the producers realized they had driven the series into a dead end with all this stuff. The cult, the genetic engineering, the runes, the green liquid, all of that was left behind when development began on the next Halloween sequel. Those ideas weren't the only things disregarded either. To get Halloween and Michael Myers back to the basics, the decision was made to act like parts 4, 5, and 6 never happened. Jamie Lloyd never existed, and Laurie Strode never died. The 7th Halloween would act like it was the 3rd Halloween, serving as a direct sequel to the first two films. A lot of fans who had been invested in the story of Jamie Lloyd were disappointed to see her getting written out of existence, but other fans were very excited to see Jamie Lee Curtis and Michael Myers face off again for a rematch, 20 years in the making. We'll talk about Halloween H2O and that whole new Halloween timeline in the next video.
How sweet! Fresh meat!
Blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
The choose-your-own-adventure aspect of the Halloween franchise has made it one of the most original and complex franchises in horror. While they were originally trying to keep the same continuity going forward with the exception of Halloween 3, it eventually got too convoluted and just plain crazy to keep track of. What started as an escaped mental patient killing hapless babysitters had turned into a story about pagan cults, incest, and weird psychic connections that fluctuated from sequel to sequel. After 20 years, the team behind the films decided they needed a fresh slate, a way to reboot the franchise without losing all the groundwork that they had already laid. How do you do it? Can you ask the audience to ignore the previous movies in a series? While sometimes filmmakers had just ignored other movies in a franchise to create their own vision, this was the company that controlled the movies, asking fans to ignore 4 films and only accept the films going forward.
It had never been done before.
The only linchpin to this whole scenario would be a returning final girl and a return to the stalk and slash roots of Michael Myers. For this to work, the storyline from Halloween 4 through 6 had to be erased from existence. No more Jamie Lloyd, no more Cult of Thorn, and no more Michael fathering a kid with his niece. While it's sad to lose some of it, other things are better left to the dustbin of time rather than revisited. With this video series, we break down the different paths Halloween went down while trying to figure out its own mythology. Here we continue with the H2O timeline, which sweeps away the Jamie Lloyd storyline along with the non-connected Halloween 3. As we've mentioned before, it's the simplest of plots that John Carpenter was able to turn into one of the most suspenseful movies committed to film.
The blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
An escaped mental patient who killed his sister when he was a young boy runs into a couple of young high school girls and becomes obsessed with one of them. He spends the rest of the night killing them off one by one until his doctor finally is able to stop him with 6 shots.
Couldn't have shot him 6 times.
You think I'm lying, Sheriff?
I think you missed him.
Only for him to escape and kill again. The biggest thing Halloween 2 adds, or detracts depending on your point of view, to the Halloween mythos is that while Loomis is traveling around Haddonfield to find Michael's whereabouts, he stumbles onto the fact that Laurie Strode is actually Michael's baby sister who had been adopted out after his tragic slaying of Judith. Carpenter himself has said this was a horrible mistake. He felt he needed a hook to explain why Michael would be so obsessed with Laurie. This one story point has impacted the entire franchise and backed it into a corner. The 20th anniversary of the franchise was approaching, and Dimension Films were working on another film. Scripts were being written and ideas thrown around. Little did they know their biggest Halloween casting was about to fall into their lap. While Jamie Lee Curtis left the horror genre to pursue other acting opportunities, she never forgot what her first big break was. With the big anniversary coming up, she had decided a return to the franchise that made her famous would be a fun treat for the fans and a full circle moment for herself.
And I thought, I'm still in the movie business. I can still get a job. Wouldn't it be interesting if we went back and made a 20th anniversary movie?
But she didn't want to return alone. She was able to get a meeting with Dimension between herself, John Carpenter, and Debra Hill. While Dimension was enthusiastic about bringing the team back together for another Halloween, John Carpenter wasn't. He felt he was owed some back royalties from earlier films and hoped to rectify that with this meeting. His asking price to direct was alleged to be $10 million. Dimension balked at the amount, so Carpenter decided to leave the project. With Carpenter out, so was Debra Hill. While she was sad that the group wasn't coming back together, Lee decided to stay on for a new film. Luckily for her, right after signing on, Scream hit the big screen and reinvigorated interest. Since Scream had been such a big hit and showed a lot of love for the Halloween franchise, they turned to the hottest screenwriter in Hollywood at the moment, Kevin Williamson. He was hesitant to take the job as he was in the middle of production on Dawson's Creek in North Carolina. Luck would have it that Jamie Lee Curtis was also in North Carolina working on a project, so the two would meet up for lunch and discuss ideas for the new film. After some back and forth, Williamson would turn in a treatment for the new film that the company could go off of. The script was written and Steve Miner was brought in to direct the film. All the pieces fell into place to get the film out in time for the 20th anniversary. In the new film, we find that Dr. Loomis had recently passed away and his nurse Marion, played by Nancy Stevens reprising her role from the original film, had been taking care of his affairs. She returns home one night to find her door ajar. When she goes inside, she finds her house has been vandalized and Dr. Loomis's files have been scattered everywhere. Michael is also waiting for her. It turns out Laurie Strode has been living under the assumed name Carrie Tate. Her son John also lives with her on the school grounds. She's been divorced and is now an alcoholic as she tries to forget her past. With the 20th anniversary of the death of her friends approaching, she begins to worry that Michael could find her. She seems to have reason to worry as Michael indeed does show up looking for his sister and nephew. He ends up bringing death to the school, which is thankfully almost empty as it's fall break. Laurie has to face Michael one more time as they finally reconcile their family connection. The film had a mildly troubled production. The rights owner Mustafa Akkad had a stern set of rules about the character Michael Myers. He loved the character and more importantly, he loved the money the character made him. While the thought had been for a few sequels now to fully kill off the character, he always said no. Every ending of a sequel had to have an escape clause already set up for Michael Myers to return. In this film, they again brought up the idea of finally killing Michael, seeing as Jamie Lee Curtis was back, and it would be a fitting end for the villain. Akkad would not budge on this stance. It was finally agreed that they would give the illusion that they were killing off the character by decapitating him, but in the next film would have an easy explanation as how he was still alive. Akkad would only agree to this if they filmed this reasoning while they were shooting the end of the movie so that they would already have it on film, and also if Jamie Lee Curtis would at least cameo in the next film to help explain this plot twist. She reluctantly agreed, but it was settled. Then they had issues finding the right mask for the film. Initially, the mask had been agreed upon by all parties, but by the time the film ended, 4 different masks were used throughout the film. John Carl Buechler created one, K&B Effects created one, Stan Winston created one, and a digital mask was used for one scene in the film.
What the fuck is this?
These looks all mixed together to have the mask look very inconsistent throughout the film. The Buechler mask was used in the opening scenes of the film, while the K&B mask was originally used in the film but was changed during reshoots. It can still be seen in some of the shots. The Stan Winston mask was used throughout most of the film, including some reshoots of scenes that previously had the K&B mask. The weird thing about the film is that while it was stated by the studio and filmmakers that it ignores Halloween 3 and 6, it does actually take a few things into account. In Halloween 4, we learn that Laurie died in a car accident and left behind a young daughter. Here in this film, she admits to her new boyfriend that she faked her death in a car accident. If looked at as a connection to part 4, it would make her an awful mother for leaving behind a daughter to deal with Michael Myers while she went off to have a new family and a new life. As we'll see, she apparently has no problem leaving her children behind for new children in later entries as well. At the time, H2O would go on to be a big hit. The reunion of Laurie Strode and Michael Myers had brought out fans to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the franchise. Michael had once again stalked and slashed teenagers and faced off with his sister yet again. He had been beheaded, and that left fans with their jaws on the ground. Now what? A few ideas were thrown around, but eventually it was decided to go with the idea from writer Larry Brand. His idea saw a mixture of reality TV and a pinch of the old War of the Worlds radio show. Here, an online mogul would set up a scenario of having teenagers spend the night in the Michael Myers house only to make the audience think that the Shape had in fact returned to kill them off one by one. It would be fake, of course, until the actual Michael Myers did return, and he wasn't very happy that all these teens were in his house. At the beginning of the film, we learn the sad truth that Laurie didn't kill Michael Myers. He had grabbed an ambulance driver and switched places with him. While Michael disappeared into the woods, the van carrying the driver is stolen by Laurie. After it crashes, she decapitates whom she thinks is a pinned Michael. Afterwards, she finds out that instead she has killed the ambulance driver who had his throat crushed to prevent him from talking while wearing the classic Michael Myers mask and overalls. This sends her into a mental breakdown. She ends up in an asylum where she has become nonverbal, just like her brother. Michael finally tracks her down and finally end their feud once and for all. He breaks into the asylum but finds out she's been waiting for him. They have a chase up to the roof where Laurie thinks she's gotten the better of him, but after the last traumatic turn, she has to be sure it's actually Michael. As she reaches for his mask, he grabs her and stabs her in the stomach. Before she falls to her death, she kisses him, and with Laurie dispatched, Michael Myers decides to return home. Little does he know that Dangertainment has moved into his house and they're setting up an online event where a group of kids will spend the night in Myers' house and viewers can watch along with head-worn cameras and different rooms set up with different angles. When the event starts, viewers think they see Michael Myers appear, but it's only a stunt. Feeling relief, they watch with glee until the real Michael shows up and the real killing starts. One of the biggest things people hate about this movie is that the head of Dangertainment is Freddy, played by rapper Busta Rhymes. When asked about this, Mustafa Akkad places the blame right at his teenage son's feet. He says his son said Busta was a super cool guy and that kids loved him, so he was happy to cast him in his movie. Whether you like him or hate him, it's guaranteed that no one expected a kung fu fight between Busta Rhymes and Michael Myers to be in the next Halloween sequel. With Laurie Strode's story finished, or for now at least, the rest of the movies just sort of staggers around without much to do. While the idea of presenting a Halloween movie in a pseudo-found footage style could be an attractive thought, it played better on paper than in practice. The character of Michael Myers does better in a routine suburban setting. He hides in the shadows and could walk out of a corner of a room at any time to dispatch the latest person who has wandered into his eye line. Here, with the cameras covering every room of the house, it takes a lot of the suspense out of it and loses things that originally made Michael Myers scary. None of the characters come off as likable. While Michael had fallen into the role previously of being the villain that people rooted for to kill obnoxious teens, there usually was at least one character that the viewers came to care about. Here we get very little to work with as far as backstory or relationships between the characters. While most have signed on to this project to hopefully become famous, without a leading character like Laurie Strode to anchor the series, we're left wandering aimlessly through the rest of the movie, not really caring who lives or dies. Michael's big motivation in this film seems to be that he wants the teens out of his house. Anyone over 25 can relate. Seems like a sad ending for the series, as it did go on to underperform. The end of Michael Myers seemed to be at the hands of Busta Rhymes after getting set on fire. While we do get our obligatory shot of Michael opening his eyes on the morgue table, this would mark the end of the series before Rob Zombie would come in to reimagine the film series. While the killer was stalking his way into a second decade, all it took to bring him down was in fact a Busta. Sad.
How sweet. Fresh meat.
Blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
Halloween, as you've seen in this series, is a franchise that has been a little all over the map. Classic genre-defining entries, random sequels, sequels that have nothing to do with the main franchise, and of course, a remake and a sequel to that remake. It's had elements added and taken away that turn it into something completely different than the original concept of the babysitter murders would have ever dreamed. However, unlike some of its slasher contemporaries, Halloween never went to space or 3D. Although it nearly did. After the success of his first film and mostly failure of its sequel, Zombie was done with the franchise. They had been the most strenuous, difficult professional times in his life, and he had pretty much said all he wanted to say through the first two movies. Malika Akkad, current head of the group that owned the rights to the Halloween franchise, and Miramax Dimension, the production company that had released the most recent entries, were ready to keep the current timeline going, with or without Zombie. And after the success of their own 3D remake, My Bloody Valentine 3D, Todd Farmer and Patrick Lussier were commissioned to script the film and turn in a draft in only 8 days. As production began, however, the studio shut everything down after feeling the entire thing was being rushed. Or because the company ran out of money, whichever you choose to believe. This is as far as Halloween 3D would go. Starting in 2009, the film would be teased and talked about, with release dates of 2012 and 2014 being discussed, until it eventually just disappeared. The movie begins at the end of Halloween 2 with Laurie killing Michael, only to discover Loomis under the mask. It's here the film does something that no other Halloween film has done. It turns into a sort of road movie with Michael and Laurie wanting to be near each other and being protective of one another. Sheriff Brackett is the only other returning character, but we are introduced to a handful of new ones. At various points, Tom Atkins was attached to appear as a doctor, a great wink to the original Halloween 3, with Tyler Mane set to come back for a third film as Michael, and Scout Tyler Compton signing on as Laurie. While I won't go through the whole movie here, the script can be found online and it is worth a look. It's filled with naming connections to John Carpenter like McCready Dam and Pliskin Park, and has some genuinely fun ideas and set pieces that could have worked on screen. After the craze of 3D died down, the film was even positioned to be part of the found footage craze, but everyone involved agreed that the project had gotten too far away from the heart of the original idea. After too much time in development hell, 3D was dead, and a new project titled Halloween Returns was announced in 2015. This film would look to not be a remake, but a genuine sequel to the original 2, wiping away everything after 1981's Halloween 2. It would be scripted by Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, with the directing duties falling to Dunstan. The pair had written the Feast trilogy and a few of the Saw sequels, while also being the creative minds behind The Collector and The Collection. Their film would take place in 1988, with Myers serving time in prison on death row for the murders from the original film. Although the murder count would include those at the hospital, it is never mentioned as happening. Power outage during his execution would lead to his escape and eventual new killing spree in the town of Russellville, Illinois, and a confrontation with a child of one of the original victims and his teenage friends. Again, littered with nods to past films that this new iteration tried to erase, something we would see in the films that actually got made. This screenplay even boasts post-credit scene reintroducing Dr. Sam Lewis, a character conspicuously absent from the film proper. In December 2015, the Akkad family would announce that Halloween Returns was canceled, and because Dimension Films had failed to get out a film as scheduled, they had lost the rights to the entire film franchise. There were a few other horror production companies that had made an impact on the 2000s that would have probably done fine with the franchise. Platinum Dunes had already handled remakes of other slasher franchises, while Ghost House Pictures helped bring to life new incarnations of Evil Dead and Poltergeist. Blumhouse Productions ultimately went out to make the film with Miramax, to be released by Universal. Blumhouse was no slouch either. Founded in Los Angeles by Jason Blum in the year 2000, Blumhouse has a mix of big-budget franchises as well as taking a chance on smaller, more independent projects. With rights in hand, Blumhouse chose a rather untraditional pair, David Gordon Green and Danny McBride. Yeah, that Danny McBride.
You know, I see the look on your faces. You're thinking, hey, Kenny, you're from America. You probably have a printer. You could have just gone on the internet and printed that bitch.
While not known for horror by any means, this writing, acting, directing duo was comfortable with each other and were huge fans of horror, with a particular love for Carpenter's slasher-defining original. McBride and Gordon Green had worked together in projects like Pineapple Express, Your Highness, Vice Principals, and Righteous Gemstones. While that might not look like the ingredients for a Halloween movie, we got something the franchise needed. Pieces began to fall into place as longtime collaborators came on to work on the film. John Carpenter, who hadn't been involved in the franchise since Halloween 3, came back to be an executive producer and consultant, claiming, and I quote, "Well, if I'm just flapping my gums here, why don't I try and make it as good as I can? So, stop throwing rocks from the sidelines and get in there and do something positive." Hearing this from Carpenter, an admittedly jaded person about most of his past properties, was a shot in the arm for all involved. We also got Laurie Strode to return. Jamie Lee Curtis had come back before. Halloween, H2O, and Resurrection each would have been swan songs for the character, but neither proved to be as fulfilling. This film's main conceit is that only the first film happened, and we get to see the very real emotional scars from the character, and that appealed to Curtis enough to come back, even work closely with Gordon Green on the feel of a now grandmother Strode. Simply titled Halloween. The movie opens with two investigative journalists who are wrapping up the investigation of the Haddonfield murders for their podcast. We see that Michael Myers has been incarcerated in a high-security mental hospital since that fateful night, and the pair have brought his mask to try to get some sort of reaction out of him, even though Loomis's replacement and former student Dr. Sartain says he has said nothing since he came here. The credits open with a new but familiar song. All the songs have shades of Carpenter's other films because, well, he did the entire score for this one. With no luck from Myers, Dana and Aaron go to the other main piece of the puzzle from 40 years ago. Laurie has had trouble dealing with that horrible night and has become a survivalist, ever preparing for the night Michael either dies in prison or comes for her so she can handle it herself. We learn she tried to have a normal life, even having a daughter, but that daughter was taken when she was only 12 due to issues of Laurie's ability to give her a normal life. She gives them little new information before kicking them out, acknowledging that Myers is to be transferred out that night. We're then introduced to Laurie's daughter Karen, son-in-law Ray, and granddaughter Allison, who live a pretty standard suburban life, with Allison worrying more about school and boys than whatever happened in the past with her grandmother. We get a fun scene with Allison and her friends that poke fun a lot at the original sequels and any of the familial relations that the previous films tried to hammer home between Michael and Laurie. Carpenter always felt it made the shape less scary, and Green and McBride certainly agreed. As the kids are prepping for a Halloween party, Laurie is seemingly prepping for war as she cleans and loads guns and attempts to make herself mentally prepared. Dana and Aaron head back to their hotel to gather notes while we get to hear old recordings of Dr. Loomis discussing what Michael is. Donald Pleasance had passed decades prior, but the guy doing his voice is close enough to feel like it could have been cut content from the original.
My suggestion is termination. Death.
Laurie meets with Allison, Karen, Ray, and Allison's boyfriend for dinner, and you feel the emotional detachment as Karen and Ray don't want her there, and Laurie is unable to hold it together, with Myers being transferred in mere hours. All the actors do a great job, but this is Jamie Lee Curtis's movie. She was so young and inexperienced when she became the Scream Queen with the first film, but is now able to give a much more nuanced and mature performance while also pulling off a badass when need be. She has spent 40 years alternating between prepping yourself for a confrontation that may or may never happen and attempting to have what you perceive to be a normal life. To the surprise of no one, Michael breaks out of the prison transport and begins again what he started all those years before. He gets another jumpsuit from another mechanic and kills the podcasting duo before getting his original mask back. The references and callbacks fly fast and furious throughout the whole film. From Michael appearing blurred in the background to seeing the masks from Halloween 3 out on the street to certain dialogue taken directly from other films, the writers spent a lot of time sending winks and nods to longtime followers of the franchise. For many, though, it can be downright distracting from the story overall. Michael goes on his spree through the town, including a brutal streak that has several long takes that drive home how sadistic and random his killings are. One of the deputies from the first film here, played by Will Patton, agrees with Laurie that evil should be put down, but when he and Dr. Sartain find him, the good doctor proves to be a hindrance and helps Michael kill the officer, his obsession with Myers driving him insane. Allison's friends are killed off, and we get a showdown of the 3 generations of Strode women versus Michael in Laurie's war bunker of a house. After a tense game of cat and mouse, the final confrontation ends, and it all being an elaborate trap for Michael as the 3 remaining protagonists lock him in a fiery jail and escape, showing the emotional damage done to all 3 Strode women in one final callback post-credits of Michael still breathing in the background just as he did 40 years prior. The movie was a smash success, making $255 million on a budget of roughly $15 million, and garnered mostly positive reviews from both critics and audiences alike, certainly higher on both counts compared to the films of the previous 30 years. In July of 2019, it was announced that Halloween would receive not 1, but 2 sequels, with Halloween Kills set to release on October 16th, 2020, and Halloween Ends set to premiere a year later on October 15th, 2021. Of course, the global pandemic had other ideas, and the films were shifted to 2021 and 2022, respectively. In June of 2021, we got our look at the first full-length trailer for Halloween Kills, showing the film taking place immediately after the events of the previous film, similarly to the way Halloween 2 played out after the events of the original. Casting brings back the survivors of the original while adding Anthony Michael Hall as Tommy Doyle and Kyle Richards, Nancy Stevens, and Charles Cyphers back as their characters from the very first film. The movie premiered at the 78th Venice Film Festival on September 8th and garnered mixed reviews from those who had seen it with early screenings, with McBride and Green at the helm for all three. Hopefully we have a fun and cohesive trilogy of films that finally does justice to a character that has been put through the ringer for the last 40 years.